Welcome to the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast. I'm K.M. Weiland, and I am here to take you deep with story theory, writing techniques, and the incredible wisdom of story. I believe story is the greatest power on this earth, and that as writers, we carry the torch of wielding that power with responsibility, passion, and skill. There's no such thing as just a story. Today, it is my honor and my purpose to help you write your best story, astound the world, and maybe change your life. Hello and welcome. You are listening to The Secrets of Story Structure, Part 3, The First Act. The first act is the first major section within story structure. It comprises the first quarter of the story and focuses primarily on setting up and introducing the plot. As the foundation of everything, a solid first act ensures your plot can achieve solidity and depth in subsequent acts. Within the first act, we find three important structural beats: the hook at the 1% mark, the inciting event at the 12% mark, and the first plot point at the 25% mark. The hook, which we discussed in last week's episode, begins the story by introducing the first domino in the row of causality that will allow each scene to lead into the next. At that point, the protagonist will likely not yet be engaged in the main conflict. What happens at the hook begins to set up the conflict, providing the first bit of foreshadowing and context. The inciting event, which we will discuss next week, divides the first act in half, providing the story's first important turning point. It symbolically represents the call to adventure and invites the protagonist to engage with the primary conflict. The first plot point does not discretely belong in either the first act or the second act. Instead, it creates the threshold or doorway of no return between the normal world of the first act and the adventure world of the second act. The first plot point is when your protagonist becomes fully engaged with the primary conflict. From here, the protagonist will not be able to turn back from the pursuit of the goal without consequences. We will discuss this all-important beat in more depth in a few weeks, and if you want to learn more about the symbolic importance of the normal world and the adventure world, you can check out my new book, Next Level Plot Structure. So from this brief overview, you can see that the primary focus of the first act is not the immersion of the protagonist in the story's main conflict. Rather, the first act is where the story develops the reasons the character will choose to engage with the antagonistic force later on. The story will go full on in the second act. For that intensity to make sense, the first act needs to provide context for what follows. You can think of the first act as foreshadowing for the second and third acts. It is the plant to the subsequent payoffs. After hooking readers, your main task in the first act is to put your early chapters to work introducing your characters, settings, and stakes. 25% of your book might seem like a tremendous chunk of the story to devote to introductions, but if you expect readers to stick with you throughout the story, you must give them a reason to care. Mere curiosity can only carry readers so far. Once you've hooked their sense of curiosity, you must then deepen the pull by creating an emotional connection between them and your characters. These introductions include far more than the moment of introducing the characters and settings or explaining the stakes. In themselves, the presentations of all the important characters probably won't take more than a few scenes. After the actual introductions is when your task of deepening the characters and establishing the stakes really begins. In one sense, the first act is like a program for a play. Its primary purpose is to prepare readers for what's in store. You're using these early chapters to indicate which characters are important, what type of story readers can expect, and where the journey will take them. The first quarter of the book is where you compile the necessary components for your story. Anton Chekhov's famous advice that if in the first act you have hung a pistol on the wall, then in the following one it should be fired is just as pertinent in reverse. If a character fires a gun later in the book, that gun should be foreshadowed in some way in the first act. The story you create in the following acts can only be assembled from the parts you've shown or foreshadowed in the first act. Your first duty in the first act is to allow readers the opportunity to learn about your characters. Who are these people? What is the essence of their personalities? What core beliefs will be challenged or strengthened throughout the book? If you introduced someone in a characteristic moment, as we discussed last week, then you are already able to show readers who this person is. And from there, the plot can build as you deepen the stakes and set up the conflict that will explode halfway through the first act in the inciting event and later at the first plot point. Now, every story spreads out the arrival of important cast members differently. Usually, prominent actors should all be on stage by the time the bell rings at the end of the first act. You can find exceptions in which prominent characters don't arrive until late in the story, for example, Cynthia in Wives and Daughters. But these late arrivals must be well planned. An arbitrary new character is never a good idea. So try to introduce all the following players within the first act. The protagonist. Introduce the protagonist as quickly as you can in the first scene, if possible. The early introduction of the main character signals to readers this is the person whose story they're reading, and therefore this is the person to whom they need to attach loyalty. The antagonist. You'll usually introduce or at least foreshadow the antagonist early on, both to get the conflict rolling and to foreshadow the opposition to whatever your character cares about. The love interest, particularly if your story is a romance, but even if the love story is only a subplot, you will most likely bring your protagonist's love interest on stage in the first act. Although you don't have to signal these two people will end up in love, you can at least signify the character's importance with an early introduction. Sidekick. Some supporting characters will be important, some won't. Those who will be at your protagonist's side for the majority of the book deserve at least a short intro sometime before the first plot point. And mentor. Mentor characters, which may or may not be mentor archetypes, such as I discuss in my book, Writing Archetypal Character Arcs, can enter a story just about anywhere in the first two acts, depending on their importance and the size of their roles. When possible, avoid convenient plot twists later on by introducing, or at least foreshadowing, a mentor character's existence in the first act. As your characters walk onto the stage, they will bring the stakes along with them. What they care about and the antagonistic forces that threaten what they care about must be shown or hinted at to foreshadow the deepening conflict of the second act. Keep in mind the arc you're trying to create for your characters. Some characters may need to endure a nuclear holocaust to learn their lessons and change their ways. Other times, the catalyst a story needs, i.e. the worst thing that can happen, will be smaller and more intimate. So whatever the worst thing ends up being, you must set it up in the first act. If your character's daughter is going to be kidnapped, the first act is the place to show readers how much her daughter means to her. You can't up the stakes later on without something first being at stake. And it's not enough to merely mention whatever is at stake for your characters. You must also take the time to develop it. Don't be in such a hurry to get to the action that you neglect this foundation in the first act. You can explain the stakes outright. I love my little girl, the mother says. I would do anything to make a better life for her. Or you can prove them through action. For example, the mother lovingly swings her daughter at the playground. Or you can use both. The more proof you supply of your character's investment in something, family, job, honor, etc., the higher the stakes will be when that thing is threatened. The first act is your first and most important opportunity to supply this proof. Once the first plot point hits at the 25% mark, the story will move too quickly to fully establish these important aspects of your character. And finally, you need to introduce your story's settings. So why is it important to introduce prominent settings in the first act? Aside from the necessity of grounding readers in the story world, well-planned settings will empower your story with continuity and resonance. Your setting is the visual frame that unifies your story. If your book takes place in a prison, That's the box in which readers will put your story when they think about it. Shawshank Redemption and The Great Escape. What do you think about when you hear those titles? The prison setting is what defines them and frames their plots. But what if you write your prison story so the character doesn't land in jail until the first plot point at the 25% mark? What if the settings in the first act won't ever be seen again? Maybe your protagonist starts out as a loving father who is wrongly accused of murder and tossed into the pen. You spend the first quarter of your story establishing his normal world with his suburbanite family, and then bam, he's in jail and he won't return to the suburbs for the rest of the book. Even if you introduce a new batch of settings later on, your early settings are crucial for establishing character and stakes. Early settings can also create contrast when your poor protagonist is dumped in the brig later on. Setting is the foundation of verisimilitude. Make readers believe they're in a real place, and you've won half your battle against their skepticism. So, setting should never be an arbitrary choice. Consider what settings the plot will require, and then try to create a strong reading experience by eliminating extraneous settings. A limited number of settings gives both you and the readers less to keep track of and allows more opportunities for deepening existing settings. A handful of important settings will allow you to create thematic resonance when you return to them at key moments in the story, thus bringing their presence in the story full circle. So let's say your jailbird dad in the previous example is released from prison during the story's climax. If you stage your closing scene back home in the suburbs, you'll bring your story full circle, neatly closing the frame you opened in the first act. By the same token, if he doesn't get to go home at the end of the story, you might want to question whether opening with the suburb setting was really your best choice. So what if the protagonist is on a journey with no main setting? Journey stories present a different set of challenges. What you'll need to create in this sort of story is a transient setting. Alert readers that the characters will be jumping from setting to setting, and then ground readers with the details that will remain the same no matter where the characters are. If they're with a camel caravan in Egypt, or just driving cross country in their Jeep 4x4, these in essence become the primary settings no matter where the characters go. The hectic nature of journey stories, particularly adventure stories, creates a milieu in which their exoticness is the setting. When you open the story with an exotic setting and plant the expectation that the character won't be staying long, you're providing the same foreshadowing as you would by using a more domestic story's first act to accustom readers to one or two prominent settings. All right, so let's look at examples of the first act from our chosen movies and books. Starting with Pride and Prejudice. So 10 pages in, we've met all the major characters, learned about the setting, and seen what's at stake for the Bennet daughters if one of them can't ensnare the unwitting Mr. Bingley. By the time we reach the first plot point at the end of the first act, we've gotten to know all the sisters, the beauty and sweetness that will eventually win Jane a husband, the independence and strong opinions with which Elizabeth drives the conflict, and the foreboding irresponsibility of the youngest daughter Lydia are all in place and ready to be developed later in the story. We've also been introduced to the Bingleys, Darcy, and Wickham. Before the first act is over, Bingley is in love with Jane, and Elizabeth has made up her mind to dislike Darcy, the two factors that will drive the story to come. It's a Wonderful Life. Under the guise of explaining George Bailey to novice angel Clarence, the senior angels show us the prominent moments in George's young life. We see him as a child saving his little brother from drowning, going deaf in one ear, and preventing old Mr. Gower from accidentally poisoning a customer. We glimpse him as a young man planning his escape from crummy Bedford Falls, even as he becomes smitten with the lovely Mary Hatch. By the time the inciting event strikes, we know George Bailey inside out. We've been introduced to Bedford Falls and its colorful array of denizens, and we've learned of the stakes from George's father, who explains the importance of the Bailey brothers' building and loan in giving the people a financial haven from evil old man Potter. Ender's Game. Card uses his first act to establish his setting, the orbital battle school, where brilliant young children train to stave off an alien invasion. We learn about this strange and brutal place through the eyes of the main character, Ender Wiggin, who is a new arrival. This also allows us to learn about Ender. We see his determination and his kindness, but also the underlying bedrock of his ruthlessness, around which the entire plot turns. Almost all the significant supporting characters are introduced. Readers are shown what is at stake, not only for the human race, but also for Ender, if he does not overcome the handicap of his extreme youth in order to flourish in this place. And Master and Commander, the far side of the world. After the initial onslaught of the furious opening battle, the movie slows considerably to allow viewers to get to know the main characters, the captain, the surgeon, and other featured crew members. The opening battle already demonstrated the high stakes, and the characters' reactions, most notably the captain's intense desire to refit the ship and re-engage the enemy, help us understand why they're fighting and what will happen if they fail. As the crew repairs the battle damage, we're also given an inside view of the ship, the primary setting throughout the story. So here are the top things to remember about the first act. Number 1, if the hook has done its job, you can safely slow the action to thoughtfully introduce and deepen your characters. Number 2, the characters' salient personality points, motivations, and beliefs should all be developed. Number 3, the pertinent points of the setting must be fleshed out so you don't have to slow down in the second act to explain things. Readers should already be oriented by the time the first plot point arrives. Number 4, the reader's bond with the characters helps raise the stakes. Make clear what the characters stand to lose in the coming conflict to drive the point home. And number 5, every scene must matter. Each scene is a domino knocking into the next domino/scene, building inexorably to the first plot point. So stay tuned. Next week, we will talk about the inciting event. And in the meantime, come talk to me. Do you take the time to introduce your characters, settings, and stakes in your first act? And that brings us to the end of this episode of Helping Writers Become Authors. I hope you'll stop by the site for a full transcript of this episode and to join in the conversation in the comments. Tune in for next week's episode, where we'll continue to explore all things writing and storytelling. If you'd like to support the podcast, it always means a ton when you take a moment to leave a quick rating or review on Apple Podcast, Amazon Music, or Spotify. To stay updated on all the latest content I create for you, the best way is to join my mailing list at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com/mailing list. You'll also immediately gain access to lots of free resources, including my books, Crafting Unforgettable Characters and 5 Secrets of Story Structure. For real-time connection with me, more writing advice, and behind-the-scenes glimpses, follow me on Instagram at authorkmwyland. A heartfelt thank you to each one of you for your support and enthusiasm, and especially those of you who support my work on patreon.com/kmwyland. You help make my site, this podcast, and so many other resources available to writers everywhere. So until next week, keep writing, keep dreaming, and most importantly, keep being true to your stories. Thank you for being part of Helping Writers Become Authors.